Today we learn all you need to know about HTML forms. You can create an HTML form by using the form tag. You have an opening and a closing tag, and the form usually an important attributes when working with forms is the action attribute and the method attribute. The action is really important when working with a server or PHP, for example. So the action attribute basically tells where to send this form. So if you basically have a PHP script, you tell that this form will basically be sent to this PHP script, and then this PHP script, for example, would define how to work with the form data. So this is not that important for us right now, but it's important to know once you start working with a server. The method basically defines how you send the data you send via this form. And there are basically two ways to send your data. You can use the get method or you can use the post method. If you use the get method right here, your data will basically be appended to your URL and everyone can see it. And if you imagine you have a form with, for example, a username and a password, and you append this username and the password to your URL, it's probably not the best idea because this would definitely not be secure. And if anyone would read out your URL or stuff like that, he would be able to get access to your username and your password, which obviously isn't something you want to do. So if you want to use a secure way to send your data, you always use the post method. And by using the post method, your data which you send to the server is basically encrypted. So if you have important data like a credit card number, a password, whatsoever, always make sure to use the post method. When do you even use the get method? So the get method is really good if you have like websites where you have parameters like the colors of shoes and so on. So imagine you're browsing on an online store website and there are different colors. You could basically take the color the user selected, save that color in the URL, for example. The user can copy the link, for example, and if he uses the same link to get to the same website later on, he has already pre-selected the certain color. So the get method is really useful if you want to bookmark a page, for example, and pre-select certain filters, for example. Inside of this form, you can use as many input fields as you want. We can, for example, use a text input field that could have the name username and the ID of username. Let's take a placeholder of username and say that this input field basically receives the username. Now let's add a second input field that, for example, takes a password as well. We add a name of password and an ID of password again, and a placeholder of password, for example. So now we accept a username and a password. Imagine this is a register form. You will obviously also need a button to submit this register form, so the username and the password to a server, for example. And we can create this submit button by using an input field of type submit. And now we can create a value, which could, for example, be register. And once we save, we have this register button right here. And this value is basically the text that you see over here. And every time you use a form where you want to submit data to a server, for example, you need an input field of type submit or a button that basically submits your data to the server. And once you have this submit button, and once I click on this register button, but since we didn't really define a location to submit this file to, we are basically getting this error page. And as I already mentioned, you'll usually have a PHP file, for example, where you redirect to. So we could, for example, say, okay, we get to the index.php file, for example, once we submit this form. And now we can like reload this, but obviously we don't have this index.php file, so we get an error. But this is basically the way forms work in HTML. As you can see, if we use the get method right here, and we type in a username like hello and a password of monkey, and then we press register, you can see that we basically have this URL now, which has a username, which equals hello, and a password, which equals monkey. And imagine you have a friend and you want to share a link with him, and you basically just copy this, and you have your password and your username basically saved in here. You send it to your friend would see your password and your username, which would obviously be like really risky, not a secure site, and nothing you ever want to do. So in this case, you could, as I mentioned, use the post method. And now if we use the post method right here and we type in a username and a password and press register, there's nothing saved inside of our URL. Inside of a form, you can use the fieldset tag to group certain elements to a logical group, basically. So we can, for example, copy this, use the fieldset tag, and inside of this fieldset tag, we'll save our username and our password. Now let's go to the bottom and we reload our page. And as you can see, we basically have this group of username and password right now. We could, for example, create a second field set, and we could say that we'll add an input of type text right here, and we'll accept a gamer tag right here with an ID of gamer tag again, and a placeholder of gamer tag, for example. And now we have this second field, so this second group basically, that could, for example, group game related information. And by doing so, you can basically create different subgroups inside of a form. Inside of this field set, you can use a legend if you want to do so. And inside of this legend, you could create a description for this group. So this could, for example, be gamer information, if you want to say so. And now you have this gamer information inserted into this group. And you could create a second legend for your general user information, for example, and name this user information. So now you would basically have two groups, one group that contains all of the user information and one group that contains all of the gamer information inside of one form. Now I want to go over certain attributes that are really important when working with forms, and one of them is basically the placeholder. We've already seen the placeholder just gives you a hint text basically that shows you what this input field is used for. You can also add the required field. If you add the required field to your form and press register now, it will give you a warning saying that you have to fill out this field. By using the value attribute for a field, you can create a predefined value that will show up to the user once he loads the page. So you could, for example, say, I am a user, and once I load the page, you can see that our username field is basically pre-populated with the value. If we create a check mark, for example, so a checkbox, by using input checkbox, we have the checked attribute, which says that the field should basically be checked once the page is loaded. So once the user gets on the page, the checkbox is already checked when using the checked attribute. And this is all you need to know to understand forms in HTML.